After 3 years apart, my wife saw me on the beach. Her expression changed when she saw who I was with. This is the story of Rayan Khalid and his wife Nadia Khalid, née Siddiqui. They had been married for 7 years before the silence between them became louder than anything either of them had said in years. Theirs was not a marriage that collapsed in a single night of raised voices or revealed secrets. It dissolved slowly, the way salt disappears into water, invisibly and completely. Rayan was a man who expressed love through presence, through the small and unglamorous acts of staying, while Nadia had come to mistake his steadiness for stagnation. The tension between them was never about cruelty. It was about two people who had stopped truly seeing each other, who had replaced intimacy with routine and called it a life. What would unravel them was not betrayal in the conventional sense, but something more insidious, the quiet, accumulated weight of one person feeling unseen and the other not knowing or not caring enough to look. The apartment smelled like cumin and warm bread on Friday evenings. That was the rhythm of their life. Rayan home by 7, Nadia in the kitchen, not because she loved cooking, but because it gave her hands something to do while her mind traveled elsewhere. 7 years of Fridays. 7 years of the same table, the same 2 chairs pulled slightly too far apart. Rayan was 34 that year, a civil engineer whose work required a particular kind of patience, reading land, understanding stress fractures, knowing that what looked solid on the surface could be quietly compromised beneath. His colleagues respected him, his clients trusted him. He was the kind of man who remembered how people took their tea and who stayed late without announcing it. At home, he carried the same quiet reliability, and somewhere along the way, Nadia had begun to read that reliability as a lack of ambition. Nadia was 31, beautiful in a way she was entirely aware of, educated and deeply frustrated by a version of her life she hadn't agreed to consciously, but had somehow arrived at anyway. She had a master's degree in communications and worked part-time for an NGO that she'd once found meaningful and now found exhausting. She told herself she stayed in the job for the purpose, but purpose had quietly drained away, and what remained was a low-grade restlessness she didn't know how to name, so she named it Rayan's fault instead. She had a friend. His name was Farhan Mahmoud, a man she'd known from university who had reappeared in her life 2 years into the marriage at a mutual friends gathering. He was the kind of man who listened with his whole face, who made observations about your personality that felt like discoveries, who texted back within minutes. He made Nadia feel interesting again. Rayan knew about Farhan the way you know about weather, peripherally, unthreatened. On this particular Friday, Nadia mentioned Farhan 3 times in 40 minutes without noticing she had. Rayan noticed. He said nothing. He refilled her glass of water and asked whether she'd submitted the grant report she'd been stressed about. "Next week," she said, looking at her phone. "You'll be fine," he said. "You always figure it out." It was meant as reassurance. She heard it as indifference. Later, when the dishes were done and Rayan was reading on the sofa, an old habit that Nadia had once found comforting and now found isolating, she stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment and watched him. She was trying to feel something she could name. He looked up, caught her eyes, and smiled in the unhurried way he always smiled, the way that meant, "I see you, I'm here, nothing is wrong." She went to bed without saying goodnight. He stayed on the sofa longer than usual that night, the book open but unread in his lap. He was a man who was slow to speak, but not slow to feel. And what he felt that night was something he didn't want to look at directly. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly. It was more like the sensation an engineer knows well, the recognition that something is bearing weight it wasn't designed to carry, long before anything visible gives way. He turned off the lamp at 11:30. He lay beside her in the dark. She was already asleep, or pretending to be. There was a distance of 8 inches between them that felt, in the silence of that room, like something that could not be measured in inches. The following months moved the way water moves through stone. Not dramatically, but with the patient certainty of erosion. Rayan began noticing things he had previously dismissed as moods or stress. the way Nadia's phone screen tilted slightly away from him when he sat beside her, the new habit of long lunches on Wednesdays that she mentioned only when he asked, the particular brightness that entered her voice in certain conversations, not when she spoke to him, but when she spoke about certain things, certain plans, certain people. He didn't raise these observations. That was Rayan's nature. He was not a man who accused. He was a man who watched. He understood, and the structural language of his profession, that confronting a fracture too early, without the right information, could accelerate collapse rather than prevent it. So he watched, and he felt the specific loneliness of someone who is physically present in a life but emotionally excluded from it. For Nadia, those months felt like breathing again. Farhan had begun meeting her for coffee more regularly, always framed as friendship, always technically true enough for her to believe her own framing. They talked about books, about her dissatisfaction with her work, about what she might have done differently. Farhan had a way of telling her that her intelligence was wasted, that she deserved more, and she received these words like water through cracked ground. She told herself it was just friendship. She told herself that Rayan's inability to make her feel seen had forced her to find that elsewhere. The logic held together as long as she didn't examine it. One evening, Rayan came home to find her laughing at her phone at the kitchen table. She didn't look up when he came in. He changed his shoes at the door, poured himself a glass of water, stood at the counter. She finished typing before she looked at him. "Good day?" she asked. "Long," he said. "There's a side issue in Bahawalpur. I'll probably have to travel next week." "Okay," she said, and looked back at her phone. That okay, the speed of it, the absence of any follow-up question, sat in Rayan's chest through dinner. He remembered a version of her that had wanted to know every detail of his projects, had made him explain the engineering to her over and over because she found the problem-solving beautiful. That woman had been replaced by someone who could absorb news of his departure in a single syllable. After dinner he tried, not dramatically. That wasn't his register. "Are you all right?" he asked. "With us, I mean, in general." She looked up from the dishes. Her expression arranged itself into something measured. "I'm just tired, Rayan. Work has been difficult." "That's not what I asked." A pause. She dried her hands with the kitchen towel slowly. "I'm fine," she said. "Are you all right?" It was a deflection so smooth she may not have known she was doing it. He let it go. He was not a man who pushed. Later he would understand that his willingness to let things go was both his greatest patience and his deepest wound. That he had given her years of room to drift, because he believed, genuinely, that people returned when given space, not knowing that some people, given enough space, simply left. He traveled to Bahawalpur the following week. He called her on the second evening. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She sounded distracted. He didn't ask why. In a small guest house room in the middle of the Kholistan, he lay on a narrow bed and understood with a clarity that arrives only in unfamiliar places that his marriage was in trouble in a way that had moved beyond weather. He felt grief before confirmation. He felt it the way he recognized structural failure. Not with alarm, but with the slow, sure weight of something known. He came home on Friday. She was out for a lunch that ended at 6. When she came home, she was lighter than he'd seen her in months. She kissed him on the cheek, briefly, like punctuation, and said the traffic had been terrible. He said nothing. She didn't ask about the trip. That night, while she slept, he picked up her phone from the nightstand, not to snoop, he would tell himself, but because it was buzzing and he'd reached for it instinctively. The screen lit. "Farhan, today was everything. I meant what I said." Ryan placed the phone back carefully, on its back, face down. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He did not wake her. He did not check anything else. He had, in the language of his profession, confirmed the fault line. Now he had to decide whether to reinforce or to walk away from the structure entirely. He chose that night to say nothing. Not out of cowardice, but because he understood that the conversation that was coming required him to be fully clear, fully calm and entirely honest with himself about what he wanted. He wasn't sure yet what he wanted. He waited 10 days, not strategically, not as punishment, but because he needed to sit inside what he knew before he could speak it out loud. He continued coming home on time, cooking on the nights she worked late, asking the ordinary questions of ordinary life. She moved beside him like someone who had already half left her room, still visible, but no longer quite present. On a Tuesday evening, when dinner was done and the television was off and there was no ambient noise to hide behind, he said it. "I need to talk to you about Farhan." She stilled. Not dramatically, the word still is wrong actually. It was more like a density shift, the way air changes pressure before rain. "What about him?" Her voice was careful. "I read his message the night I came back from Bahawalpur, by accident. I don't want to argue about whether I should have. I'm telling you what I know." Nadia set down her cup of tea. She looked at the table rather than at him. Rayan watched her and felt something strange. Not rage, not the hot welling of jealousy, but a kind of enormous tiredness, as though he had been carrying something for years without realizing its weight, and had finally, just now, set it down. "It's not what you're imagining," she said. "Tell me what it is, then." The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. Then slowly she began to speak, and what she said was not the confession he had prepared for. It was something more complicated. She told him that she had felt invisible for years. She told him that Rayan's steadiness, which the world interpreted as strength, had felt to her like absence, that she had needed him to want her, to fight for her attention, to bring an urgency that he had never shown. She said Farhan had made her feel like a full person, not just a function in someone else's life. Ryan listened to all of it. He was quiet in the way that is not the silence of suppression, but the silence of someone genuinely receiving information. When she finished, he said, "Did you sleep with him?" A pause that was itself an answer. "Once," she said, 3 months ago. It wasn't a relationship, Rayan. It was a mistake." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands on the table. "I think what hurts me most," he said finally, "isn't what you did. It's that you decided I wasn't worth telling, that you watched me make you tea and ask about your day and travel away and come back, and the whole time you were—" He stopped. "You made that decision alone. I was going to tell you. Were you?" She didn't answer. "I've been asking you for months if you were all right," he said. Not suspiciously, just sincerely. "Every time you said fine, I believed you because I wanted to. And I think I also believed you because I was afraid of what happened if I didn't." He paused. "That's on me. That's something I have to live with. So what now?" Her voice had a tremor in it. "I don't know," he said. And it was the truest thing he'd said in years. Not the anger she'd expected, not the ultimatum, not the storm. Just the plain, exhausted truth of a man who did not yet know how to hold what had happened. He slept in the other room that night. Not in anger, in need of space that was genuinely his, perhaps for the first time. She sat in their bedroom with the lamp on for a long time. Part of her had expected the confrontation to release something, guilt or clarity or even his grief, which would at least mean she still mattered enough to hurt him. But Rayan's quiet had not been the quiet of suppressed feeling. It had been the quiet of a man beginning, slowly, to step back from something. That was what frightened her most. They separated 3 months later, not with lawyers immediately, not with a single dramatic move, but the way couples who have run out of language separate gradually, then one day, undeniably. Rayan found an apartment in DHA. It had white walls and very little furniture at first, which suited him. Nadia stayed in the flat. She told her mother it was mutual, that they had simply grown apart. She told her closest friends something closer to the truth, but still edited, that Rayan had been emotionally unavailable for years, that the marriage had been hollow long before anything else. She said this often enough, with enough detail, that she began to believe the architecture of it. It was not a lie exactly. It was a narrative she had built from true materials, assembled in a way that positioned her pain as consequence rather than cause. Farhan, who had spoken with such conviction about what she deserved, grew quieter after the separation became real. He had wanted the version of Nadia that was slightly forbidden, slightly unavailable, thrillingly present without full claim. The version who needed him in the practical daily ways that actual life required was a different proposition. They stopped seeing each other by the fourth month. He did not call it an ending. He simply became gradually unavailable, the way some people end things, by erosion, which she recognized only because she had once done the same to someone else. She did not tell anyone about that part. Rayan, in his white apartment, rebuilt himself in the way that quiet people rebuild, not loudly, not performatively, but thoroughly. He read more. He cooked for himself, which he found unexpectedly meditative. He took on a large project in Lahore that required full attention, and he gave it full attention and found, to his surprise, that he still loved his work, that his capacity for care had not been used up. He began to run in the mornings along the canal. He had never been a runner. He was not graceful at it, but there was something in the physical discipline of it, the way it cleared his mind, the way it returned him to his body, that he found necessary in a way he couldn't articulate. He met Sana Tariq at a colleague's dinner that winter. She was a landscape architect, direct and funny, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing herself, rather than from performing herself. They did not fall into anything fast. He was deliberate and honest with her from the start. I am recently separated. I am still in process. I have nothing to offer except honesty. She respected the transparency. She matched it. By the following spring, they were seeing each other with the steady intention of two adults who had both learned what carelessness cost. He filed for divorce 14 months after the separation. It was handled without ugliness. Rayan had no interest in injury. He wanted the thing resolved, not as victory, just as completion. Nadia received the papers on a Thursday. She sat with them for a long time. She had told herself she was fine, had repeated the story of her reasonable grievances so many times that she had been genuinely surprised to discover she was not fine. The paper in her hands, the bureaucratic finality of it, produced a grief she hadn't predicted. Because it was one thing to believe you had chosen to leave something, it was another thing to understand, at last, that it had also left you. She called her mother that night and cried for the first time properly and didn't explain why. Her mother said, it's okay, you'll be okay. And Nadia said yes, of course, and sat in the apartment that was now entirely hers and felt its size for the first time. It was Eid weekend, 3 years after the separation, and Nadia had traveled to Karachi to visit a university friend. It was the kind of trip that is also an escape from the apartment, from the city, from the version of herself that city contained. Her friend Hira had a house near Hawke's Bay, and on the second morning they walked to the beach. And the sea was the particular shade of gray-green it becomes when the sky is overcast, and the air smelled of salt and rain that had not yet arrived. She saw him from a distance. She recognized the way he stood first, that particular stillness of his, rooted and unhurried, the posture of a man who has learned to occupy space without apology. He was standing near the water's edge with his shoes off, holding them in one hand. He looked older in the way that some men look better. Older in the way that some men look better. Older in his features. Beside him was a woman. She was laughing at something, turned toward him, one hand at her collarbone, the unguarded laughter of someone who feels safe. Rand was looking at her the way he used to look at engineering problems he loved, with full, patient, interested attention. And there was a small child between them, a girl, perhaps 2 years old, who was running in that confident, unsteady way of children near water, shrieking with the specific joy of cold sand. Rayan reached for the child a moment before she tumbled, caught her with the calm reflex of someone practiced at this, lifted her, and the child grabbed his collar and pressed her face against his neck. Nadia stopped walking. Hira said something. Nadia heard it at a remove. She had imagined, in quiet moments she never admitted to anyone, that she would see him again and understand that she had made the right choice, that he would be what she had decided he was, a man too still, too contained, too little. She had needed that story to remain true. But what she saw on that beach was not the man she had built the story around. What she saw was a man who had somehow, without her noticing, become fully himself. He turned. He saw her. There was a long moment, perhaps 5 seconds, in which neither of them moved. His expression did not become guarded, which would have been armor. It did not become warm, which would have been invitation. It was simply recognition. She existed. He saw her. The fact of her presence was neither wound nor gift. He lifted his chin, the small nod that means I see you, the gesture of two people who once shared a life and now simply share a world. She raised her hand slightly, half a wave, the movement of someone who no longer knows the correct greeting for a person she once knew every version of. Then he turned back to the water, to the woman, to the child who was demanding, in the insistent language of toddlers, to be put down so she could run again. Nadia watched him set the child on the sand and hold her hand instead, and the child pulled at his arm, leaning toward the sea, and he leaned back just enough to keep her safe, without stopping her motion. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds more. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come, past Hira, who asked with that. And Nadia said yes and kept walking. She sat down on a piece of driftwood further up the beach, her back to the sea. She looked at the sky, which was doing what gray skies do, simply being present, neither threatening nor resolving. She thought about the word she had used so many times in the years since, unavailable. She had said Rayan was unavailable, emotionally unavailable. She had said it so many times it had become fact. But sitting with the image of that morning, his hands, his patience, the way the woman beside him occupied space with confidence rather than performance, she understood, with this specific clarity that comes from being unable to lie to yourself in certain moments, that what Rayan had always been was available in ways she had not been looking for. And she had called that absence. There is a particular kind of grief that has no event at its center. No singular moment to point to, no decision that can be unmade. It is the grief of a life that could have been and was not because of tragedy, but because of ordinary blindness stained over ordinary years. It does not announce itself loudly, it simply settles. She sat on the driftwood until Hira found her. She didn't explain. There was nothing to explain that would not require dismantling the version of events she had lived inside for 3 years. And she was not ready for that. Perhaps she would never entirely be ready. Perhaps that was also part of what she had to carry. The sea continued doing what the sea does, moving, without memory, without malice, simply forward. Rayan walked home along the beach with his daughter on his hip and Sana's hand in his free hand. And the sand was cold under his feet, and somewhere behind him was a woman who had once been his wife. And he felt not triumph, not relief, not the complicated satisfaction of being seen to have survived, only the plain, quiet weight of a life that had taken the shape it had taken. Some things you don't recover from. You don't get over them. You simply grow large enough, slowly, that they are no longer the whole of you. That is all. That was Rayan Khalid. That was Nadia. That was all of it.